Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We pick up from where we left off last night and we left off speaking about the various causes of criticism of a hadith. And we mentioned that in total there are 10 of them. Some of them have to do with critiquing the actual narrator himself, and some have to do with critiquing the hadith itself. Okay? So far we've only taken one of those 10, and that is that the narrator is proven to have lied in the hadith. And we said that this particular type of hadith would be called what? Mawdu'. Tamam? So now we pick up with the rest of them. Ibn Hajar, rahimahullah, he says, والثاني المتروك والثالث المنكر على رأي وكذا الرابع والخامس. The second is the matruk hadith, the abandoned hadith. The third is the rejected or munkar hadith, according to one view. Likewise the fourth and the fifth. The second one here, he's referring to now the one who is not a known liar, but one that is accused of being a liar. Okay, in other words, it's not proven, but the scholars of hadith have a strong suspicion that this person is a liar, so he's accused. Okay, there's a suspicion or a doubt cast on his honesty. How do we come to that? Because we find this person consistently narrating a hadith which are rejected. It's almost as if it's his aada. This is his custom, this is his default. Okay? Most of the ahadith he's coming with is always in opposition to the thiqat. So something's up. It's almost as if this guy is a liar. But they just haven't put a exact evidence on it to say he's a liar. Okay? So he's accused of it. The third one is where a person makes an enormous mistake. He mentioned earlier, fuhsh ghalatihi. Okay, fuhsh ghalatihi. This is an enormous mistake. Their reports will be called munkar. Their reports will be called munkar. And he says likewise the fourth and the fifth categories will be called the same thing. Okay, the fourth and the fifth categories will be called the same thing. Which one was the fourth one? Ghafla, being heedless in his narrations. And the fifth one was being morally corrupt, having fisq. All right. So number one, the person who is a liar, their hadith is called mawdu'. Number two, the person who is accused of lying. The person who is accused of lying, their hadith is called matruk. The third one is the person who has fuhsh ghalat, enormous mistakes. His hadith is called munkar. The fourth one is the one who is ghafil, heedless in his narrations. His hadith are also called munkar. And the fifth one, or the fourth one, the fifth one is the one who is an open sinner. Okay, his ahadith are also called munkar. Tamam? And this too is due to the realization that this person is consistently coming with errors. All right? He goes on to say, ثُمَّ الْوَهَمْ. Then comes wahm. إِنْ اطَّلَعَ عَلَيْهِ بِالْقَرَائِنِ وَجَمْعِ الطُّرُقِ فَالْمُعَلَّلِ. Then there's wahm. Okay? This person also has errors. If it is detected through contextual indicators and by gathering the various transmission routes, it is classified as the defective or mu'allal hadith. Okay, as the mu'allal hadith. Like, what's the difference between this type of error and some of the ones that have already passed? This one is not easily spotted. Okay, this one is not easily spotted. This one is hidden. Tamam? This is the difference here. Here, when we look at when the person has made an error, the hadith will be called mu'all. The hadith will be called mu'all. In addition to this, Imam Ibn Hajar, or Hafid Ibn Hajar, he explains to us how he explains to us how we're going to spot this mistake. Tamam. Here he explains to us how we can spot this mistake. All right. A mistake can occur in both the matan and the isnad, as we all know, in the wording of the hadith itself, as well as the chain of transmission. All right. Or it can occur in both. But not every mistake is going to be considered a illah, okay, a defect. What do we mean when a hadith is an illah? Number one, the error must not be easily caught. Okay, it must not be easily caught. For example, there are certain errors that occur in a hadith which are very clear and open to everyone, the student and the expert. You come across a chain of narration and a tabi'i is saying the Prophet ﷺ said. Anyone who knows this is a tabi'i and knows this is the Prophet ﷺ knows that there's what in between? Huh? No. A gap. Because it's not always a sahabi, it could also be another tabi'i. Okay? But that's very easy to spot. You know that something is wrong here. But not every error in a hadith you can put your finger on like that. It requires some investigation. All right? So in order for something to be considered an illah, it first and foremost must be hidden. Okay? It must be difficult to detect. وَلِذَلِكَ some of the scholars, they would say, وَلَيْسَ الْعِلَّةُ مِمَّا يُدْرَكُ بِظَاهِرَ الْإِسْنَادِ ذَا مُشْتَرَكُ. And a illah is not something that is easily spotted. Okay? It's apparent. بظاهر الإسناد, with the apparent isnad, that is something that everyone can find. All right, so it must be hidden. The second condition for a hadith to be considered an illah is that the hadith or the error must have a negative impact on the hadith. For example, this error, it changes the meaning of the hadith completely. Okay? This is what we mean when we say that the illah or the hadith has a illah. Not only is it hidden, but it also has a negative impact on the hadith, changing its meaning. Tamam? When these two negative qualities are found, then we say that this hadith is mu'all. It has a hidden defect. Okay? And a hidden defect, as we mentioned, is not spotted by just any person working in the field of hadith. It's spotted by the specialists, the huffaz. The same way we can find in our daily lives. For example, if someone is sick, okay, مثلا, I have a cold. I know I have a cold. And I know how to treat it. I can go and take some over-the-counter medication. Okay? But not every illness will the person be able to know what is going on. In this case, I have to do what? I have to go to some kind of specialist, some kind of doctor. Okay? If I don't know what's going on. The same thing with the field of hadith. There are certain things which are wrong in a hadith that anyone and everyone can spot. But there are certain types which we put into the hands of the specialists. Okay? Abu Hatim al-Razi, one of the scholars of hadith, someone brought him a book of hadith to review and to grade. Abu Hatim took the book and he flipped through its pages and he began to say, this hadith is weak. This hadith is authentic. This hadith has a defect. This hadith is like this. And the man is looking at him surprised. And he asks him, أَتَدَّعِيَ الْغَيْبِ? And I haven't even told you anything about this kitab. Do you claim the unseen? You know the unseen, you have some special knowledge? He says, no, this is a specialty a field which I've spent my entire life in. I know how to spot these things. So the man, not taking his word for it, Abu Hatim says, go to someone else and get a second opinion. So he goes to Abu Zur'a, and Abu Zur'a tells him the exact same thing. Okay? Showing you what? That the experts in this field are the ones that are able to spot this. And how do we spot it? Ibn Hajar, he tells us. He says, وَجَمْعِ الطُّرُقِ, by combining or gathering all of the various paths. Okay, a hadith comes from multiple paths. How do you know that a mistake occurred in it? First, you have to look at all the other paths. If all the other paths lead to a specific wording, and this one is saying something different, then you know that this one is a what? A mistake. Okay, a mistake.
So then, with the two conditions that it has to not be easily caught and negative impact, does that mean that the Mu'alil Hadith has to have an issue in the Markan itself and not in the chain of it? Because there could be a chain where maybe only a certain specialist knows that this person did not meet the other person. Would that be a Mu'alil Hadith if it has a similar Markan?
Yes, because it can occur in both. It can occur in both. Okay. So this is how we get to know when there is a illah, by combining or bringing together all of the various paths. And this is exactly what they used to do in order to spot these hidden mistakes and defects. Yahya ibn Ma'in, rahimahullah ta'ala, this was his job. Yahya ibn Ma'in, to show it in actual practice, he went once to a scholar of hadith by the name of Affan ibn Muslim. Okay, he went to Affan ibn Muslim and he asked him if he could learn from him or hear from him the books of Hammad ibn Salama. Affan ibn Muslim, when he heard this from Yahya, he was very surprised. He said, you haven't heard the books of Hammad ibn Salama? And you're a scholar of hadith, you're an imam. All the students have heard these books already, and you haven't? Yahya ibn Ma'in, he says, no. I've already heard it from 17 other teachers. You're the 18th. Affan ibn Muslim slams the door in his face. What's the point? You heard it from 17 others. Now you want to hear it again. But Yahya ibn Ma'in is on a mission to do what? Gather the various paths. He's taking the ahadith of Hammad ibn Salama from all of the students of Hammad ibn Salama. Why? Because Hammad at times would make mistakes. So he wants to know when Hammad made the mistake or when it was one of his students. So you have 17 students narrating hadith from Hammad. If they all come together on a mistake, if they're all narrating the same mistake, then that means that mistake came from who? Hammad. But you wouldn't know that unless you did what? Gathered all the paths. But if 16 of those students are saying the same thing and one is saying different, then you know that mistake came from Hammad or that one student? That one student. All right. So once Affan ibn Muslim rejected his request, he went to another teacher and heard the books. Okay, fadl.
Can a hadith be ahad and mu'allal at the same time?
Yes, it can. Because ahad does not necessarily mean what? That it only has one chain. It can have multiple chains as well. Right? Then he goes on to say, ثُمَّ الْمُخَالَفَةِ, then contradiction. إن كانت بتغيير السياق فمدرج الإسناد أو بدمج موقوف بمرفوع فمدرج المتن أو بتقديم أو تأخير فمقلوب أو بزيادة راو فالمزيد في متصل الأسانيد أو بإبداله ولا مرجح فالمضطرب. Then the contradiction or the mukhalafa, depending on the way that this contradiction occurs, it will be called something different, okay, depending on what type it is. And he mentions a few here. He says, if it occurs by altering the sequence, yani the order, then it is what we will call mudraj al-isnad. Okay? Or if it is due to merging a mawquf report with a marfu' report, then it is going to be called mudraj al-matan. Okay, so these are two. Mudraj al-isnad and mudraj al-matan. These are two types of contradictions. Mudraj is when there's something not from the hadith that does not belong in the hadith, it's been inserted into it. Okay? There's some type of addition taking place here. And this can occur in the actual wording of the hadith, as he mentions, mudraj al-matan, and it could occur also in the chain of narration, mudraj al-isnad. The first type, okay, which is mudraj al-isnad, is pretty self-explanatory. You have a fully connected chain, let's say it's 5 people in it, and that's what's correct. Then a person comes and he narrates this hadith, this chain, with 6 people. What did he do to this chain? He added a person in it. There's been an addition, and that's incorrect. This is what we call mudraj al-isnad. Okay? There's been an addition into the chain of transmission. Like, what about idraj, or an addition in the actual wording of the hadith? How does this happen? Sometimes when a narrator reports a hadith, right after he may comment on the hadith. So you have a shaykh, he's narrating hadith to his students, and then at the end of the hadith, he explains it a little bit. Maybe a student doesn't know that's what the teacher is doing, and then he goes on to narrate that hadith with the explanation of the shaykh attached to it. Okay, he added that to the hadith when he passes it on. So this is called mudraj al-matan. There's been an addition to the actual wording of the hadith. And this is something that we find in many ahadith actually, but we know that it has occurred, so it's fine. Okay? For example, there's the hadith that's found in Bukhari and Muslim from Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, where the Prophet ﷺ, he said, إن أمتي يدعون يوم القيامة غرا محجلين من آثار وضوء فمن استطاع منكم أن يطيل غرته فليفعل. My ummah will be summoned on the day of resurrection with bright faces and hands and feet from the marks of wudu. So if any of you can extend his brightness, let him do so. This last part where it says, so if any of you can extend their brightness, let him do so, is the words of Abu Hurairah and not the words of the Prophet. Okay? But some of the narrators, when they heard this from Abu Hurairah and they went on to pass the hadith, they added that into it as if it was the words of the Prophet. All right? But again, in these particular cases, we know that this is the words of the Prophet and this is the words of Abu Hurairah, so there's no problem. The problem occurs when we don't know. Okay? The problem occurs when we don't know. Tamam? The next type of mukhalafa that he mentions, okay, so far we've said mudraj al-isnad, mudraj al-matan. The third type of contradiction or mukhalafa, he says, or by advancing or delaying. This is called maqloob. This is called maqloob. When something is flipped. All right? Something is inversed or reversed. And this can occur also in the sanad or the matan. This can occur in both the sanad and the matan. All right? So here we're talking about a type of mistake which occurs both ways. The first is giving a matan the incorrect isnad. The first is giving the matan the incorrect isnad. Okay? قلب سند لمتن. Yani this hadith, these words of the Prophet ﷺ comes through a specific chain. Now when the narrator comes to narrate that hadith, he uses a different chain completely. Okay? He has now attached to this wording of the Prophet ﷺ a chain that does not belong to it, aslan. Okay? The hadith, إِنَّمَا الْعَمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, we know it has how many chains? 1. Okay? That particular chain, if the person is not narrating that hadith with that chain, then we know he brought a new chain to it and added or connected it to that wording of the hadith. And this is called qalbu sanad limatin. Okay? Or maqloob. And this is a example of it occurring in the sanad. It can also occur in the wording of the hadith itself, where something is flipped. For example, there's the hadith also in the Sahihain where the Prophet ﷺ, he mentions that there are, on the Day of Judgment, 7 people who have shade. One of those people is the man who gives sadaqah to the extent that his left hand doesn't know what his right hand gives. And that's the correct way of the hadith. But some narrators, they say to the extent that his right hand doesn't know what his left hand gave. They did what? They flipped it. This is called qalb. Okay? But it's qalb in the matan, in the wording of the hadith. Alright? The next type of mukhalafa or contradiction is, he says, by adding a narrator. By adding a narrator. It is additional in a connected chain, al-mazid fi muttasil al-asanid. Okay, and this one is also self-explanatory, meaning the chain is already fully connected, yet someone comes and adds an additional person to the chain. This is called al-mazid fi muttasil al-asanid. Or by substitution, without a preponderating factor, it is confused, al-muttarib. Okay, now we have an example of where the mukhalafa, the contradiction, is where the person narrating the hadith is contradicting his own self. Or he's contradicting his own self. This is called muttarib. Okay? This is called the muttarib hadith. A reporter of hadith, he doesn't only pass on a hadith once in his lifetime. Okay, especially if he's a shaykh, a well-known shaykh, he has many students. He's teaching all his life. The same hadith he's narrating multiple times. So maybe one time he narrates it a certain way, and then another time he narrates it another way, contradicting his own self. Okay, one time he narrates the hadith in a mursal form, meaning the tabi'i from the Prophet. The next year he narrates the same hadith and it's fully connected. There's no break in the chain. If we cannot figure out which one is the correct way, then we say that this hadith is what? Muttarib. It's confused. Okay? We call this one muttarib. And it's when he contradicts his own self. All of these we just mentioned, all these 5, generally are known as mukhalafa, contradictions. He goes on to say, Fadl.
What's the difference between mazid fi muttasil al-isnad and mudraj al-isnad?
In reality, there's no difference. Okay? So he just gives 2 terms that can refer to the same thing. Okay? As we mentioned, there are many ways to explain the same concept. Some scholars will use this term and another will use this term. Okay? He goes on to say, وَقَدْ يَقْعُ الْإِبْدَالُ عَمْدًا امْتِحَانًا أو بتغيير حروف مع بقاء السياق فالمصحف والمحرف. Substitution, or this ibdal, this inversion, it may occur intentionally for the purpose of testing, or alternating dots or vowels while the spelling system remains intact, then this is musahhaf and muharraf. The Imam will explain each one here. There are 2 points. The first one, a question is to be asked. Is it ever allowed to commit this iqlab, this inversion in a hadith on purpose? Is this ever allowed? Yes or no? Some say no, some say yes. If it doesn't change the meaning? The answer is yes, it is allowed. But he mentions when. He says imtihanan. For the purpose of what? Testing each other. To see if your memory is still good. Meaning, it's not going to be done while someone's on the minbar talking to the people. It's going to be done in a closed circle between students and their teachers. Just when they're revising hadith to test one another. Okay? They'll purposely flip something to see if you catch it. And if you don't, that means you're slipping. Okay? And we find this done throughout the practices of the hadith scholars. We find, for example, Yahya ibn Ma'in, rahimahullah, In one occasion, while he was traveling with his travel partner, which was Imam Ahmed, they went for Hajj. On their way back home to Iraq, Yahya ibn Ma'in wanted to stop by in Yemen in order to visit their Shaykh, okay, Fadl ibn Dukain. Why? He wanted to test his Shaykh, to see if his Shaykh's memory is still good. Imam Ahmed said, we don't need to do that. His memory is good, let's go home. But Yahya ibn Ma'in insisted. So they went. What did Yahya ibn Ma'in do? He took a paper and he wrote 30 ahadith that he took from his teacher previously. Okay, so he wrote 10 hadith. After the 10th, he inserted a hadith which is not from the hadith of the Shaykh. Then he wrote another 10. Then he inserted a hadith which is not from the hadith of the Shaykh, and so on. When they met with him, the Shaykh, he was delighted to see them. He put Imam Ahmed on his right side. He put Yahya ibn Ma'in on his left side. And then Yahya gave the paper to a student that was sitting in front of the Shaykh and said, read it to the Shaykh. These are his ahadith we want to see. So the young man began to read. And whenever the hadith was the hadith of the Shaykh would remain quiet. But when that young man read the hadith which Yahya inserted, the Shaykh said, this is not my hadith. Cross it out. And the young man continued. And another hadith came up and the Shaykh said, this is not my hadith, cross it out. And very quickly the Shaykh understood what was going on. He was being tested. So the Shaykh, he looks at Imam Ahmed and he says, you are too dignified to be doing something like this. I know it's not you. This wasn't your idea. And you, the student sitting in front of him, you're too, you're not there yet. You're still a young student. You're not bold enough to do this. I think this came from none other than you. And he pointed to Yahya ibn Ma'in. And he kicked Yahya ibn Ma'in out of the house. Okay, he upset the Shaykh. But he was happy at the result. And that is what? That the Shaykh was still sharp. Okay, he tested his Shaykh and he was comfortable. All right. This also occurred with Imam al-Bukhari when he came to Baghdad. Imam al-Bukhari, at a young age, the word spread that this man had an excellent memory. So when he was coming to Baghdad, the people wanted to test him. And so the shuyukh of Baghdad took 10 students and gave each student 10 ahadith. Each one of those ahadith was maqloob. The chain of this hadith was connected to the wording of this hadith. And the chain of that hadith was connected to the wording of this hadith. They mixed up the narrations and gave 10 students 10 ahadith. But they didn't tell the students what was going on. Just take these 10, and when Bukhari comes, read it to him. We're going to see. So once Bukhari came to town and they welcomed him in the masjid, the first student stood up and began to read those ahadith. Each time the hadith is read, Bukhari is saying, I don't know this hadith. Of course, Imam al-Bukhari, he knows the hadith, but what does he mean by this? He means I don't know it in this combination. This chain with this wording, I don't know. This doesn't exist. The second student, he stands up and he reads. Each hadith he's saying, I don't know it. Until all 100 are reported to him. The people in the masjid, they're saying to themselves, who's this guy? We heard so many good things about him, he knows nothing. But the shuyukh who did this, they know that Bukhari knows what's going on now. So after it's all done, Bukhari tells the first student, stand up. Your first hadith, you said like this. But the correct way is like this. And your first hadith's chain belongs to this guy's fourth wording, and so on and so forth. All 100 ahadith, he put them back together. Ibn Hajar, he comments on this story and he says, that's not amazing. What Bukhari is doing is not amazing. Because he knows those ahadith and he knows those chains already. All he did was put it back together. He says, what's amazing is that he memorized the mistakes at the first time. That's what's really amazing. All right. So doing this type of inversion, it is allowed. However, only in the case of what? Testing one another, and that's it. All right. He also mentions here that the mukhalafa, the conflict, it can be due to a change in the dots that are written on the words, or the huruf, the letters that are used. Okay? Though the flow the flow of the word, it still remains. So for example, you have the name Umar, which has a dhamma, but then you also have Amr with a what? Fatha. Okay? It still remains, yani the name is still there, no problem, but one of the diacritical marks is off. Okay? And this is called musahaf. This is called musahaf. What about if the letter is changed? Not the diacritical mark, but the letter. You have Umayr, Ain, Mim, Ya, Ra, Umayr, and then you have Ammar. Okay, you have Ammar, Ain, Mim, Alif, Ra. So instead of the Ya, you have an Alif. This is also a type of contradiction. And this one is called Muharraf. Okay, Muharraf. When the dots are changed, it's called Musahaf. When the letters are changed, it's called Muharraf. ولا يجوز تعمد تغيير المتن بالنقص والمرادف إلا لعالم بما يحيل المعاني. He says it is not permissible to intentionally alter a hadith's content by removing or paraphrasing, except for someone knowledgeable of what changes meaning. And this is a very lengthy discussion and a deep issue that the ulama of hadith, they engage in. And it's related to if a person can report a hadith by way of meaning. And you don't report the hadith exactly with the phrase or the words that the Prophet ﷺ said, but by giving the meaning of the hadith. Is something like this allowed? Some of the scholars or some of the Salaf were very strict in this. Muhammad ibn Sirin, for example, he took the view that it is not allowed to do so whatsoever. Meaning you hear the hadith the way the Prophet ﷺ, he narrated it, and that's exactly how you pass on the hadith. You don't paraphrase it. You don't remove something. Okay? You don't summarize it. The way it is the way you pass it on. But others, they took the view, just like Ibn Hajar does here, that in some scenarios it may be allowed to do what? To paraphrase. All right, to paraphrase. And he lists conditions for that. One of those conditions is what? That the person must be a alim, a scholar, not just any ordinary person. And number two, he must have knowledge about the meaning of what he's summarizing or paraphrasing. Because what we fear is what? That a person changes the meaning of the hadith. He's saying if the person's a scholar and the meaning of the hadith remains, then it may be permissible. All right? But to be safe, a person should always caveat what they are summarizing or paraphrasing with phrases that denote that the Prophet ﷺ did not say these exact words. For example, someone is giving a khutbah and a hadith comes to mind and they want to say that hadith, but they don't remember the exact wording. So what can they say? They can say, for example, "Oh, kama qal," or as he may have said. And the Prophet ﷺ may have said what can mean, or said what can mean X, Y, and Z. Okay? You're not saying the Prophet ﷺ said this exactly, but you're saying this meaning the Prophet said. Okay? So you caveat it with that which denotes that this is not the exact wording. You're summarizing. You let the people know that you're paraphrasing. But the meaning is still what? Intact. All right? For example, someone says in a hadith, جاء رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. And another says, أتى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Is there any difference? The Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم came. The Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم came. Did it change the meaning? لا. But one word was used and another was used in the other. Okay? Paraphrasing. Okay? In these type of scenarios, the ulama of hadith, they don't really criticize it too much as long as the person's a scholar and he has knowledge of the meanings of the words. Okay? And as long as he's caveating it. Okay? As long as he's letting the people know. He goes on to say, فَإِنْ خَفِيَ الْمَعْنَى احتيج إلى شرح الغريب وبيان المشكل. If the meaning is obscure, explaining odd words and clarifying the problematic is needed. Like when there is a word mentioned in a hadith where the meaning is difficult to understand, what's required here? He says sharh al-gharib. An explanation of that odd word is now needed. Okay? Because a word that is maybe used very infrequently in a hadith will be difficult to understand. Okay? For example, in Bukhari, we find a hadith reported by Ibn Umar that the Prophet ﷺ naha an al-shighar. Naha an al-shighar. And this hadith comes with a word which is very odd. It's not frequently used throughout the Sunnah. Okay? So in this kind of scenario, the scholar needs to explain this word. Okay? Shighar, as the scholars they mention, is a marriage practice which is forbidden in Islam. Okay? Where one man and another man, they agree, I'm going to give you my daughter in marriage, you give me your daughter in marriage, without discussing a proper mahar. Okay? This is forbidden in Islam. Okay? So certain words that are obscure, that are difficult to understand, that are not frequently used, he says this is called bayan al-mushkil. This science is called bayan al-mushkil, where you explain that problematic word. Okay? So this is the science that is related to that. And this is what he's pointing out. He says, ثم الجهالة وسببها أن الراوي قد تكثر نعوته فيذكر بغير ما اشتهر به لغرض وصنف فيه الموضح. The causes for a narrator to be unknown are, okay, he mentions a couple here. Number one, that the narrator may have many names and he is mentioned with one that is not well known for a purpose. Concerning this, they compiled al-muwaddih. At times, a narrator may be known by more than one way. Okay, he may be known by more than one way. One time he's mentioned with his actual name, Fulan ibn Fulan. Another time he's mentioned by his title. Okay? For example, Ibn Hajar, his actual name is what? Ahmad ibn Ali. But he's also known as Shihabuddin. That's his title. Another time, a narrator may be known or referred to by their kunya, okay? Their honorary or their honorific or their nickname. Abu Fulan, Abu Fadl. Okay? Another time, they may be referred to by the land that they're from, if they're known by that. Okay? Fulan al-Basri, right? Hassan al-Basri, who's from Basra. And so on and so forth. But then there will come someone who refers to this same person with a name which he is not known by. He's known in these 5 ways, these 4 ways. But now we come across someone who's referring to a person in a way which is not known. Okay? In a way that is not known. So the person who is listening to this may think that this person is different, is someone else. In this science, the scholars, they compiled works which are called al-muwaddih. Those works which clarify who this unknown narrator is. Okay? Because in this case, this person is now unknown. Okay? Because they're being referred to in a way which he's not known by. Okay? So in order to clarify who this narrator is that is being referred to, they wrote books which clarify that. And those books or those compilations are called al-muwaddih. Tamam? Here he's just introducing us to an entire science in and of itself. Okay? He's saying this is the issue and these are the books that describe or clarify that issue. وقد يكون مقلا فلا يكثر الأخذ عنه وصنف فيه الوحدان. Another way that a narrator may be unknown is that the narrator has few narrations and is not frequently taken from. And concerning this, they wrote al-wuhdan. Okay? So this is another reason which causes ambiguity or a person to be unknown, is that they're very infrequent in narrating hadith. Okay? And perhaps this is the main reason that people are unknown in hadith, that they have very few ahadith. Okay? This is the sabab al-ra'isi, the main reason that the people who are unknown, because they don't narrate much. Meaning they don't have that many students that took from them and passed on the hadith. Maybe they have one student. Khalas, someone who has one student, his ahadith are not going to spread wide and far and wide. So he remains unknown. Okay? How do we clarify who this person is, who has only one person narrating from them? We go to the books of al-Wuhdan, he says here. All right? Al-Wuhdan. These are books collected to clarify for us who this unknown person is, who only one student took from. تمام؟ أو لا يسمى اختصارا وفيه المبهمات ولا يقبل المبهم ولو أبهم بلفظ التعديل على الأصح. He says, or he may be left unnamed out of brevity. Concerning this, they compiled the anonymous mentions, yani mubhamat. The third reason a narrator may be unknown is that he's not named to begin with. Okay? He's not named to begin with. Is this due to malicious intent? Here Ibn Hajar, he says no. He says it is due to ikhtisar. Due to ikhtisar, yani being brief in their narration, in the person's narration. Okay? Because he wants to be brief and quick. He wants to just summarize the chain, and he doesn't mention the guy's name. He says, for example, I heard from al-Rajul, a man. The name is not mentioned, all right? Or I was told by a Shaykh. Who's the Shaykh? Okay? I was informed by so-and-so, and he doesn't name the actual person. This type of anonymity we call mubham. Mubham. Okay? There's some type of vagueness or obscurity that's going on. طيب, what if the mubham narrator, this unknown narrator, this obscure person, what if they're mentioned with some sort of praise? Can we accept the hadith from this person now, who's saying they heard from that mubham, that obscure or vague person? For example, I say, حدثني شيخ وهو ثقة. I heard from a sheikh and he's strong. Just because I added that praise to my narration, even though I didn't mention the name of the sheikh, can you now accept this from me? No, we cannot. Okay? Because someone might be strong to me, but he might not be strong to you. And you might be the correct one. Right? He might actually be weak. We need to know who it is we're taking from. All right? So we cannot accept it even in that situation. And this is what Ibn Hajar, he says afterwards. He says that anonymous narrator, the mubham, is not accepted, even if he is mentioned anonymously with a grading of ta'adil, of praise, according to the soundest opinion. All right? Because at the end of the day, he's still not mentioned, and we need to know who this person is in the chain. Are they weak? Are they strong? How is their memory? Etc. Okay? طيب, what if he is named? What if he is named now? Okay? Does this automatically remove the jahala, the obscurity that we're dealing with? We have a person and they're finally named. Do we say, khalas, now we know the name and we accept it? Mashi, we push it, we continue moving along? Not necessarily. Because you can know a person's name, but that's all you might know about them. Sah wala la. Okay, you might know their name, but that's all you know. So here he says, فَإِن سُمِّيَ, if he's named, وَانْفَرَدَ وَاحِدٌ عَنْهُ, and only one person is known to take from him, فَمَجْهُولَ الْعَيْنِ, he's what we're going to call مَجْهُول الْعَيْنِ. Okay? Yes, we know his name now, but that's all we know. We don't actually know him as an individual. Okay? That's not enough information. Okay, one person narrates from him, and that's why we know his name. And if that's all we know, khalas, he's still unknown to us. We say this is majhul al-ayn. This individual is unknown. All right? If he is named and two or more people narrate from him, he says, أو اثنين فصاعدا, or if there's two people or more, ولم يوثق, and he has not been accredited. Okay? There's no praise found. فمجهول الحال وهو المستور. Now we know this guy's name. And now there are more people narrating from him. So now we know him a little bit better. Sah? You have one side, one person is narrating from him. Now we have another person, he's named, and 2, 3, 4 people are narrating from him. We know this guy a little bit better now. Right? But we don't have an actual praise from the scholars of hadith for him. This type of person is still going to be considered unknown. But what type of anonymity are we dealing with now? His condition. We know who he is, but is he strong or not? We don't know. Okay, we don't have any type of praise from the scholars of hadith for him. So this is called majhul al-hal. Okay, we are ignorant. We have anonymity or obscurity related to his condition. Okay, so this is called majhul al-hal. So he too is not accepted. Then he says ثم البدعة, and this is the 10th criticism that can be labeled at a hadith. All right, ثم البدعة إما بمكفر أو بمفسق. The innovation, it will either be one which takes a person out of Islam, mukaffir, or one which is a sin. Okay, meaning the person is still in Islam, still a Muslim. Okay, so the bid'ah is of different types. There's one that's very serious that a person can engage in that can take them out of Islam. And then there's some which a person engages in, they're still Muslim, but they're considered sinners. All right? This is, Afwan, is this the ninth? This is the ninth criticism, not the 10th. Okay, this is the 9th. Those whose innovation is severe, yani that takes them out of Islam and we consider them disbelievers. An example of that is that of the Rafidah, the extremist Shia. Okay, the extremist Shia. Yani those who believe in the deification of Ali, for example. Okay, they believe that Ali radiallahu anhu is ilah, is Allah. Okay, or who they believe that the Quran is not preserved. All right, or they believe that their imams can control the universe. All of these are types of beliefs which take a person out of Islam. Have no shak on that. Okay, especially in this time and age where people are confusing each other. Okay, this type of bid'ah, which is what takes a person out of Islam. If a person has it, can we accept hadith from them? No. Okay, but if a person has a type of bid'ah, which is less than that, meaning they're still within Islam, but they're sinning due to this bid'ah, can we accept from them? In one case scenario we can, and in another we cannot. Ibn Hajar is going to explain. Okay, what's an example of a bid'ah where the person is still a Muslim? Irja. Tamam. A belief which is called irja. Okay, where they delay the actions from the belief. Meaning they say that so long as a person has the belief in the heart and they profess by the tongue, then they can still be a Muslim. This is an incorrect belief, la shak, but it doesn't take them out of Islam. Okay, what's another bid'ah that doesn't take a person out of Islam? Mawlid, celebrating the Prophet's masjid, Prophet's birthday. They come together in the masjid, they party, etc. La shak, this is an innovation. But the person's still a Muslim. All right? The person is still a Muslim. How do we deal with their narrations? He says, فَالْأَوَّلُ لَا يَقْبَلُ صَاحِبَهَا الْجَمْهُورِ. The first one, meaning which one? Al-Mukaffir, the one that takes them out of Islam. The vast majority of the scholars do not accept from them at all. All right, do not accept from them at all. والثاني, as for the second one, which is mufassiq, the one where the person is still a Muslim, يقبل من لم يكن داعية في الأصح. You can accept their narrations with the exception of what? That they are not calling towards their bid'ah. That they are not calling towards their bid'ah. Okay? إلا أن يروي ما يقوي بدعته فيرد على المختار وبه صرح الجوزجاني شيخ النسائي. Okay? As long as this person, okay, he's involved in a bid'ah, that is not kufr. But he's not a da'i. He's just a regular person, just a regular narrator of hadith. You can accept from him. But you will not accept from him when the narration he's reporting is something that gives support to his bid'ah. Okay? So this guy's involved in mawlid. You can accept from him in general. But then the narration he's bringing to you is one which gives support to the mawlid. Then you don't accept from him. All right? If it gives strength to his bid'ah, you don't accept. And this is the belief or the view that the Shaykh of Nasa'i gave victory to. Okay? And his name is al-Jawzajani. Okay? He's really the one who propagated this belief. Okay? And this is what Ibn Hajar he mentions here. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, he says, or he reports from Ibn al-Mubarak, this which is being practiced this being put to practice. Okay? Yahya ibn Uthman, he narrates from Nu'aym ibn Hammad, who said, I heard Ibn al-Mubarak say, when he was asked why he left the narrations of Amr ibn Ubaid. Okay, Amr ibn Ubaid is one of the leaders of of innovations during his time. Why did you leave off the narrations of Amr ibn Ubaid, but you accepted the narrations of Hisham al-Dustawai, which also had some bid'ah? He said, because Amr ibn Ubaid used to call towards his bid'ah. Okay? So this is how the ulama of hadith used to approach these narrations. This one's a da'i to his bid'ah, we leave him. This one's involved in a bid'ah, which is not kufr, but he's not calling to it, so we may accept from him. Okay, we may accept from him. Fadl.
If a muqtadi is not calling towards the bid'ah, but it's well known about him, does that affect his adat? Like, can he be in a sahih fit?
He can still. He can still, as long as he's not calling to that bid'ah. As long as he's not calling to that bid'ah. Okay? Why? Because these bid'at, especially when it comes to the mufassiq, they have these beliefs. Why? Because they feel they have some sort of evidence for it. Okay? So this is not a person who is being arrogant about what they believe. They have the honesty still there. The trustworthiness still there. Okay? They're not known to be liars, but they have an incorrect belief. Okay? They made a mistake. This is what it comes down to. Tamam? Fadl.
I'm going to ask regarding the first one that you mentioned. If the person, like at a later stage in their life, for example, if they're practicing this, are they rejected in totality, or is it just from that point anything they narrated, or is it?
If they come back from it, you say?
If they came back, what if they didn't come back? Are they rejected in totality everything they've narrated, or is it that, like, for example, if the person wasn't an author and later on they became one, but they were narrating hadith before that, do you still accept from this person, or is it that from the moment they became one?
Jamil. Jamil. Onward you don't accept. Onward you don't accept. Okay? Tamam? He says, number 10 is ثم سوء الحفظ. ثم سوء الحفظ. Then weak memory. إن كان لازما فهو الشاذ على رأيه أو طارئا فالمختلط ومتى توبع سيء الحفظ بمعتبر وكذا المستور والمرسل والمدلس صار حديثهم حسنا لا لذاته بل بالمجموع. This is the 10th critique a person or a hadith can be labeled with? The weak memory. If it is constant, then according to one opinion, it is shadh. Okay? Meaning that this person is coming with a hadith, usually, that are incorrect. So this shows that this person has poor memory. Okay? In this case, we say his ahadith are shadh and we do not accept from him. What if that weak memory is temporary? What if that weak memory is temporary? Okay? We call this mukhtalit. We call this mukhtalit. An example of that is someone is a strong narrator all his life. Then he grows old. And then what happens? He begins to forget. Maybe he becomes senile. Okay? He changes. All the ahadith that he narrated previously will still be accepted as long as we know which ones are which. But the ahadith moving forward that he's narrating will now be what? Rejected. All right? So one is a constant weak memory. This one we don't accept. And the other is a temporary weak judgment or weak memory. Here, it depends when we are accepting it. But there is some accepting. All right? Or for example, someone is known to memorize or report a hadith from his book. When he narrates a hadith, he narrates it from his book. And what happens? He loses his books. Or his house burns down and his library goes up in flames. Okay? And this happened to many scholars. So what do we do with them? Do we say they're always weak? No, we say after that occurred, onward, now they're weak. Okay? But before that, we are accepting their ahadith and we make sure that we know which one is which ahadith came afterwards, which ahadith were narrated before. Okay? So this one is called mukhtalit, the one who later became weak. He says that these type of ahadith, okay, can become graded upwards, however. Even though they're weak in and of themselves, can they ever be raised up to a hadith which are maqbool, accepted? Ibn Hajar, he says yes. Okay? He says yes. He says whenever one of poor memory is corroborated by a reliable person, likewise the mastur narrator, likewise the mursal narration, likewise the mudallis, their hadith becomes hasan. Their hadith becomes hasan. All right? So you have a weak narrator. He has poor memory. In and of himself, this is da'if. This hadith is da'if. But now you've come across a strong narrator. And he's saying the same thing as this person with weak memory. What do we do with the hadith of this person with weak memory? We now raise it up to hasan. But it's not hasan in and of itself. Okay, we call this hasan lighayrihi. Hasan due to an external factor. Okay? But that's not the case only with someone with weak memory. Even the person who's mastur, the person who is majhul, he's unknown, and only one person narrated from him. We said that that person's hadith was weak, sah? But when you come across someone now narrating the same thing, then his ahadith can be raised up to hasan also, lighayrihi. Okay? Likewise, the hadith which is mursal, meaning the hadith where the tabi'i, he's narrating from the Prophet ﷺ. This hadith is da'if. But now you come across someone who's narrating that same hadith. Then we say in this case, this mursal hadith now is raised to hasan. Not on itself, but due to the external support. Okay? And likewise the mudallas reports. The one where a narrator is concealing who he got it from. Okay? When he's concealing someone and that's proven, we don't accept it. But now you have someone who's strong coming and narrating the same thing. Khalas, now that mudallas report, where there's a concealment, can be raised up to the level of hasan. Okay? In conclusion, so far from the beginning of the durus, we mentioned 4 maqbool ahadith. Sahih lidatihi, in and of itself. Sahih lighayrihi, due to external support. Hasan lidatihi, in and of itself. And hasan now لغيره, due to an external support. All right. ثم الإسناد, then the isnad. Okay, now we reach the topic related to the chain of transmission, and this is one of the most important topics and parts, not just of this field, but of our religion. Why? Because isnad is something that's unique to Islam. Isnad is not something that the other adyan, the other ways of life have. They're unable to connect themselves to their books, okay, or to their prophets. Rather, Islam is the only one that has this concept of the chain of transmission that's fully connected. All right. The Salaf al-Salih, they used to say, such as Abdullahi ibn Mubarak, al-isnadu min ad-din. The isnad is from the religion. وَلَوْلَا الْإِسْنَادُ لَقَالَ مَنْ شَاءَ مَا شَاءَ. And if it weren't for this concept of isnad, then anyone or everyone would say anything that they wanted. Because they don't have to prove themselves. They don't have to provide the evidence. Okay? But with isnad, we're able to provide evidences and the proofs for what we're saying or believe. All right? What about the isnad? He says here, إما أن ينتهي إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم تصريحا أو حكما من قوله أو فعله أو تقريره. Then the chain of transmission is either that which ends at the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, whether explicitly or by implication, from his statement, his action, or his tacit approval. What does it mean that it ends at the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, تصريحا or حكما? That it ends at him explicitly or by implication. Either, okay, when it comes to that which is explicit, what's meant is that this hadith goes fulan and fulan and fulan an Rasulillah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It actually ends at the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Another case scenario, which is where it's implicated, is where it ends at a Sahabi. It ends at a Sahabi. But what is that Sahabi saying? When you look at what that Sahabi is saying, it's something about the religion that he could not have come with his own self. Maybe it's something having to do with Yawm al-Qiyamah, or something having to do with the angels, something having to do with the ghaib, the unseen. Is a Sahabi going to bring something with about the religion from their own selves? La. They obviously got it from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even if they don't explicitly say it. Okay? But in that case, it's implied that it ended at the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. All right, so this is what's meant by hukman. You have one that is clear, explicit, it ends at the Prophet, and one where it doesn't, but it's implied that it ends at the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. All right. The first one, which we just mentioned, that which ends at the Prophet, whether it is explicit or implicit, this hadith we call marfu'. Okay, this isnad at least we call marfu'. It is that which is elevated or raised all the way to the end, to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, it is his words, it is his actions, it is his tacit approval. Okay, his approvals. He says, or it ends with a companion, أو إلى الصحابي كذلك وهو من لقي النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم مؤمنا به ومات على الإسلام ولو تخللت ردة في الأصح. Or it ends with a tabi'i, likewise. طيب, who is a tabi'i? Or what is a tabi'i? Afwan, sahabi. A sahabi, he mentions here, or he gives the definition or the conditions. How is a person labeled to be a sahabi? They must meet these conditions as he's mentioning. Number one, he says that they met the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Tamam? That they met the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Why do we not say saw the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Huh? Aywa. Not everyone saw him, but met him. And Abdullahi ibn Maktum, مثلا, was a blind sahabi. Okay? He used to give the adhan for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So if we say the one who saw the Prophet ﷺ, then we'll be excluding someone like him. Okay? So we say they met the Prophet ﷺ. Number two, mu'minan bihi. When they met him, they were believers. They accepted Islam. Okay? وَمَاتَ عَلَى ذَلِكَ. And they died as Muslims. So if someone met the Prophet ﷺ, accepted Islam, but then later died as a kafir, do we say they're Sahabi? La. Okay? Someone met the Prophet ﷺ, died as a Muslim, but they didn't accept Islam until after the Prophet had died. Sahabi or not? La. They will be considered a major tabi'i. They'll be considered a major tabi'i. Why? Because they should have been Muslim at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay? They not only met him, but they were believers with him at the time. All right? A Sahabi, when he narrates a hadith and it ends at him, it's his words, it's his actions. This type of hadith we call mawquf. It's not raised all the way to the Prophet ﷺ, it ends at him. This is called mawquf. It stops short of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay? What about a tabi'i? When he narrates a hadith, and when he's narrating something from his own self, when it's his own words or his own actions, this is now called maqtu'. This is called maqtu'. All right? He says, فَالْأَوَّلُ الْمَرْفُوعُ وَالثَّانِي الْمَوْقُوفُ وَالثَّالِثُ الْمَقْطُوعُ. All right? وَمَنْ دُونَ التَّابِعِ فِيهِ مِثْلُهُ. Anyone who's under the tabi'in, yani the generations that come after the tabi'in, fall under the same ruling. Meaning, someone in the 4th generation, 5th generation, if we come across their statements, this is also called what? Maqtu'. This is also called maqtu'. وَيُقَالُ لِلْآخِرِينَ الْأَثَرُ. And he says that others are also called al-athar. Okay? Also are called al-athar. Meaning, maqtu' and mawquf can also be called athar. All right? Can also be called athar. والمسند مرفوع الصحابي بسند ظاهره الاتصال. The musnad reports. Okay, the musnad report is what's attributed to the Prophet ﷺ through a companion with a chain which is fully connected. With a chain that is fully connected. What's the difference now between a marfu' report and a musnad? We said marfu', it reaches who? The Prophet ﷺ, sah. And musnad, we're saying now it reaches who? The Prophet ﷺ. What is the difference? When it comes to marfu', what we are concerned with is just the attribution of it to the Prophet ﷺ. Meaning the chain can be what? It can be broken. What we're referring to is these words. Who is it being attributed to? Is it the Prophet ﷺ, or is it the Sahabi, or is it the Tabi'i? Okay? The mere attribution of these words to the Prophet ﷺ means it's marfu'. But when it comes to musnad, now not only is it attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, but it comes with a fully connected chain. Okay? So there are two conditions there for it to be considered musnad. Okay? For it to be musnad. Tamam? He says, فَإِنْ قَلَّ عَدَدُهُ فإما أن ينتهي إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أو إلى إمام ذي صفة عليه كشعبة فالأول العلو المطلق والثاني النسبي. Now we come to some of the qualities of the isnad. If the number of narrators, he says, in the chain are few, then it either ends with the Prophet ﷺ or with an imam possessing a high ranking such as Shu'bah. The first is called the absolute elevation, al-ulu al-mutlaq. And the second is the relative elevation, al-ulu al-nisbi. What does this mean? We're now looking at an extra quality of the isnad, meaning something that is preferable to have, but is not a necessity for it to be authentic. Okay? The ulama, they like certain asanid for certain reasons. The hadith here that we're looking at has nothing to do with authenticity. All right? We're looking at a sifa zaid or zaida, an additional quality to the isnad. And what is that? We're looking at number one, that which is called ulu al-mutlaq, a absolute elevation. A chain of narration has a number of people in it. When the person is narrating a hadith and he has very few people in between him and the Prophet ﷺ, this is what's called ulu al-mutlaq. And it's obviously going to be relative to the person's time period. So for example, if someone is to narrate a hadith today all the way to the Prophet ﷺ, how many people would be between him and the Prophet? Let's say 25. All right? Then you come across another Shaykh. Okay, you have a Shaykh that's in a different city or another country. You go to him and he has the same hadith that leads to the Prophet ﷺ, but now with 23 people. Less people in the chain. His narration is called ulu al-mutlaq. It's an absolute elevation. Okay? When it leads to the Prophet ﷺ, this is called ulu al-mutlaq. What we're concerned with here is the number of people in the chain. And the scholars of hadith, they used to seek out the chains that had the least amount of people. Why? Because that means you're closer to the Prophet ﷺ. Between you and the Prophet ﷺ, instead of getting the hadith that has 10 people in between you and him, you go and find a Shaykh who has 7 people in it. That way you're considered closer to him, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. In addition to that, when there are lesser people in a chain, that means what? That there are lesser chances for what to occur? A mistake. All right? So when we're looking at the chain, the number of people in it, leading to the Prophet ﷺ, this is called ulu al-mutlaq. Tamam? Now we put that one to the side. The second one we have is called ulu al-nisbi, and this one is 4 types. All right? This second type has nothing to do with it reaching the Prophet ﷺ, the number between you and the Prophet ﷺ. Put that one to the side now. Ulu al-nisbi is a relative elevated hadith, and it's relative due to something. And he's going to mention what those things are. All right? He mentions 4 of them. He says, وَفِيهِ الْمُوَافَقَةِ وهي الوصول إلى شيخ أحد المصنفين من غير طريقه. The first type of nisbi or ulu nisbi is called al-muwafaqa, which is reaching the Shaykh of one of the compilers of hadith through a route other than his own. Okay? Muwafaqa is to narrate a chain through the route of the Shaykh of one of the authors of a compilation of hadith. So for example, Imam al-Bukhari compiled a book of hadith. Right? He has a Shaykh, and the Shaykh is named Qutayba ibn Sa'id. Okay? Now we're concerned about the number of people between you who's narrating the hadith and Qutayba, the Shaykh of the compiler. Okay? Between you and Qutayba. Not between you and Bukhari, but you and Qutayba ibn Sa'id. All right? So if a muhaddith comes after the time of Bukhari, take for example Imam al-Bayhaqi. Okay? He comes after the time of Bukhari. Now he comes and he narrates the same hadith, okay, through the through the route of Imam al-Bukhari, and he finds, for example, between him and the Shaykh of Bukhari, which is Qutayba, are 4 narrators. Okay, he has a hadith, it goes through Bukhari, through Qutayba, and between him and Qutayba are 4 people. Tamam? Then he finds another route for the same hadith, but it doesn't go through Bukhari, but it still reaches his Shaykh with 3 people. This is now called ulu nisbi, but which type? Muwafaqa. Okay, it's called al-muwafaqa. Tamam? The point here is what? That you're reaching the Shaykh of the compiler. Okay, you're reaching the Shaykh of the compiler. وَفِيهِ الْبَدَلِ وهو الوصول إلى شيخ شيخه كذلك. Now you're concerned with reaching the sheikh of the sheikh through a different path. Okay? So now you're not looking at Bukhari, you're not looking at Qutayba ibn Sa'id, you're looking at Imam Malik, which is the sheikh of Qutayba. All right? So you find the path which leads you to Qutayba, to Malik, afwan, with a smaller number of people than you can get from another path. And that would be called al-badal. Okay? You're reaching the sheikh of the sheikh. وفيه المساواة وهي استواء عدد الإسناد من الراوي إلى آخره مع إسناد أحد المصنفين. The third is called مساواة, which is the equality in the number of narrators in the chain from the narrator to its end in comparison with the chain of one of the compilers. Okay, what does مساواة mean here? It means that the author of a book, he narrated a hadith with a specific chain. Tamam? Now another person comes later on. Another person comes later on and he narrates the same hadith through another chain, and both of the chains have an equal amount of narrators in it. Okay? As an example, Imam al-Nasa'i, he narrates a hadith with 11 people between him and the Prophet. Ibn Hajar, he comes later on himself and he narrates that same hadith. And he has in between him and the Prophet 11 people, even though Ibn Hajar came later on. So what did he do with the hadith or the reports or the chain of Imam al-Nasa'i? Musawa. Equal number of people in between him and the Prophet ﷺ. He met the same number of people, all right? Even though it's through a different chain. Tamam? This is ulu, but nisbi, it's relative. We're not concerned with the Prophet ﷺ, whether we reach him with a certain number or not. Okay, that's the first type of ulu. وفيه المصافحة وهي الاستواء مع التلميذ ذلك المصنف ويقابله العلو بأقسامه النزول. Included within this, يعني علو nisbi, the relative one, is what is called musafaha, which is equality in the number of narrators with the student of that compiler. Now we're not looking at Imam al-Nasa'i, okay, meeting his number of people in the chain. Okay? Now we're looking at the student of Imam al-Nasa'i. Okay? So that would mean between al-Nasa'i student and the Prophet ﷺ would be how many? If al-Nasa'i has 11, then his student has 12. Sah? Now you come across another chain, even though you came later on, and you meet that student with the same number. And your chain leading to the Prophet ﷺ, that same hadith is also 12 people. So you have now come with the equal amount of number of people in the chain as the student, the talmid of that musannaf, that compiler of hadith. All right? These are some of the 4 different ways that ulu nisbi takes place. And as we mentioned, that these are all relative to one's time. Because the longer time goes on, then the longer the chain drags. Okay? So in our days, the chains are very long, but they're still ulu compared to one another. You might find a sheikh who has 25 people, someone who has 30 people, someone who has 19 between himself and the Prophet ﷺ. So the one who has 19 is considered ulu compared to these guys. All right? But when you're looking early on, okay, let's take for example from the books of hadith. Bukhari has a hadith which in between him and the Prophet ﷺ are 3 people. Which are 3 people. Okay? Then you have a hadith found in the Muwatta of Imam Malik. And between Imam Malik and the Prophet ﷺ are how many? 2. Okay? Nafi' and Ibn Umar. So the ahadith of Imam Malik, which have 2 people, compared to the hadith of al-Bukhari, which have 3, are considered ulu. All right? And so on and so forth. The longer the hadith gets, the more people there are in the hadith chain, the more nazil it becomes, the more lower it becomes. Okay? Each one of these categories we just mentioned has the opposite. It's called nazil, meaning the more it grows, it becomes nazil. All right? Whichever category it falls under. تمام. Each category has what is the opposite, which is called نازل. تمام. فنكتفي إن شاء الله بهذا القدر يعني. We took a lot tonight, but we want to complete the book. So inshallah tomorrow we'll be able to complete it. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.